He walked into the hospital to give blood, just another quiet act in a life built around staying unnoticed. But that day, something unexpected unfolded in the hallway. Not loud, not dramatic, just human. And it changed everything. Before we begin, if you enjoy heartfelt stories about second chances, quiet courage, and the kindness that connects us all, don't forget to subscribe to the channel. Your support helps bring more stories like this to life. Now, let's begin. Single dad donated blood and spoke 4 languages to calm foreign tourists. The CEO didn't say a word. The old air conditioning unit hummed overhead, casting a low mechanical groan across the fluorescent-lit hallway of St. Mary's Community Hospital. The place smelled like antiseptic and overripe bananas, likely from the snack tray meant for post-donation blood sugar boosts. Daniel Hayes sat quietly in the waiting chair outside the blood donation room, fingers drumming lightly on his knee, the cuff of his work shirt still slightly stained with engine grease. He wasn't here for recognition. No one ever noticed him here, and he preferred it that way. He gave blood once a month. It wasn't charity, it was routine, a ritual that made him feel useful in a world that had all but forgotten him. Mr. Hayes, a nurse, called. He stood tall but modest in demeanor, mid-40s, ruggedly handsome in a quiet, worn way. There was something about the way he moved, steady, precise, that suggested he used to hold himself differently once, like a man who used to speak in front of people or to them in rooms with more power than this one. The nurse guided him into the blood donation room. He smiled politely, rolled up his sleeve, and leaned back. 15 minutes later, as his blood flowed gently through the tube into the collection bag, the hallway outside exploded into disarray. "Help! Please! She's fainting," someone shouted in a thick accent. A woman's scream followed. The nurse by Daniel's side stiffened. "I'll check it out," she said, dashing into the hallway. Daniel turned his head just in time to catch a glimpse through the doorway. A group of elderly tourists stood in panic. One woman, clearly the leader of the group, was slumped on the floor, pale and sweating, surrounded by companions who were yelling over one another in 3 different languages. French, Japanese, and he thought Italian. The front desk nurse looked utterly lost. Daniel didn't even think. He yanked the cotton ball from his arm, pressing it hard as he stood. Blood dotted his shirt. He stepped into the hallway, holding up both hands. "Excuse me," he said loudly but gently. The crowd paused, slightly stunned by the American man's sudden appearance. Then Daniel switched to French, calmly asking, "Est-ce qu'elle est diabétique? A-t-elle pris ses médicaments aujourd'hui?" One woman gasped and nodded quickly, answering in rapid French. Daniel translated aloud to the nurse. Then he turned to the others, now speaking Japanese, asking one man to fetch the woman's bag. The man blinked in surprise, then obeyed. Behind him, a younger man in the group started sobbing in Italian. Daniel moved closer and spoke softly to him in his native tongue. The young man's shoulders dropped. He nodded. The hallway, once chaotic, was now subdued. Nurses were back in control. The patient was conscious breathing. The color returned to her cheeks. Daniel stepped back, arms still pressed awkwardly to his wound, his eyes scanning the room just in case anyone else needed help. He didn't see her at first. Behind the observation glass on the second-floor mezzanine, Olivia Morgan, CEO of St. Mary's Hospital, stood frozen. She hadn't meant to linger. She had a board meeting in 15 minutes and a PR nightmare to navigate from her father's shadow. But something about the commotion had made her stop just long enough to see what no one else had noticed. A maintenance man, judging by the shirt, just diffused a multilingual crisis with the calm precision of a seasoned diplomat. She leaned slightly closer to the glass. There was something familiar in his cadence, in his body language, not just fluidity, not someone who studied languages, someone who lived them. "Daniel Hayes," she murmured, reading the name tag from the blood donor log on the tablet in her hand. She stared longer than she should have, not saying a word, not even realizing that she was holding her breath. Down below, Daniel gently excused himself, declining help from the nurse who noticed the blood soaking through his bandage. "I'm okay," he said. "Just let me wash up." He headed to the men's room, rinsed the blood off with cold water, and stared at his own reflection. His salt and pepper beard was uneven. His eyes were tired. But behind the weariness was a flicker of something else, something that used to live inside him before life closed the door. As he dried his hands, his phone buzzed. "Lily, Dad, remember you promised pizza tonight." He smiled. Back at the nurse's station, he signed the release form. The nurse thanked him this time with more sincerity than usual. "Sir, I don't know how you knew all those languages, but that was incredible." Daniel just shrugged. Sometimes kindness speaks better in someone else's language. And with that, he walked out the door, unaware that upstairs Olivia Morgan was still watching, still silent. But her silence wasn't indifference. It was recognition. The elevator chimed softly as Olivia Morgan stepped onto the executive floor, her heels tapping sharply against the polished tile. In her hand, she held her tablet like a weapon, sleek, controlled, and constantly loaded with information. But this time, it wasn't financials or liability reports that made her swipe through the glowing screen. It was a name: Daniel Hayes. She didn't know why she'd typed it into the internal hospital system. Maybe it was the way he'd switched languages so effortlessly, or the way the crowd had obeyed his voice like it had weight. She'd worked in public health policy for over a decade. Fluency was rare. Calm under pressure was rarer. But this man hadn't just handled panic, he'd dissolved it. She pulled up his file. Daniel Hayes, age 42, occupation freelance HVAC repair technician. Address South Maple Mobile Park Unit 14. First donation 7 years ago. Total donations 36. A single scan of his medical record told her what she already sensed: he was healthy, consistent, and almost invisible. But what stood out wasn't what was there. It was what wasn't. No emergency contacts, no spouse, no employment history before 7 years ago, no insurance records, no criminal record, just blank space. Her eyes narrowed. Blank space in a life like his was rarely a coincidence. Someone knocked lightly on the office door. "Ma'am, your meeting with the community outreach director is in 5. Olivia nodded, but her attention was still on the file. She tapped the screen, saved the page under a secure folder she titled Quiet Cases. It was her habit, cataloging the people who showed up in moments of crisis but never made headlines. She believed those people were the true fabric of any institution. She just hadn't expected to find one standing in a grease-stained shirt and a blood bandage in her hallway. Across town, Daniel stepped out of his rusty Ford Ranger and into the soft light of late afternoon. The trailer park was quiet except for the distant bark of a neighbor's dog and the fluttering of an American flag someone had planted in a potted tire. "Dad," a voice called. From the steps of Unit 14. Lily, 10 years old and bursting with life, bounded toward him barefoot, a crayon still clutched in one hand. Her smile was a mix of mischief and sunshine. "You're late. I finished my homework and made you a card." Daniel chuckled, kneeling to take the folded paper from her hand. On it was a drawing of the two of them, him with a wrench and her holding a book. Above their heads floated a giant heart. "You're the best translator dad ever." He raised an eyebrow. "Translator dad. You told me you used to talk in all those languages. I saw your book collection. You've got like 6 dictionaries." Daniel smiled, but it didn't quite reach his eyes. "Just because you own the tools," he said gently, "doesn't mean you still know how to use them." Lily tilted her head, unconvinced. "You used them today, didn't you?" He didn't answer. Instead, he opened the front door and ushered her inside, where the scent of tomato sauce and frozen pizza filled the air. The place was small, clean, and clearly loved. Books lined the shelves next to old HVAC manuals. A single, framed photo sat on the TV stand, a woman with bright eyes and a quiet, knowing smile. Lily's mother, gone 7 years now. Daniel stood for a long moment staring at that photo. He hadn't used French since Geneva, Italian since Rome, Japanese since Tokyo, the conference that changed everything. And yet today, when that woman collapsed and people cried out in voices no one else could understand, it had come back not like a skill, but like a calling. He hadn't expected it to feel so right. The next morning, Olivia arrived early. She hadn't slept much. She kept replaying the image of Daniel in her mind, how he translated pain into comfort. It was the kind of thing she wished her hospital could do more often, especially now. St. Mary's was under fire. Her father's old contracts had drawn scrutiny. The board whispered about selling a controlling share to a for-profit healthcare group. She had weeks, maybe less, to prove the hospital's worth beyond its bottom line. She opened a meeting with the community liaison and paused halfway through her speech. "What if we created a multilingual response team?" she asked. Volunteers trained for cultural emergencies, language customs, emotional de-escalation. The staff blinked. Olivia continued, her tone calm but fierce. "We can't control who walks through our doors, but we can control how prepared we are to meet them where they are." It was the first time in weeks her staff looked hopeful. As the meeting broke, Olivia stayed behind. She opened her laptop. Her fingers hovered above the keys. Then she typed Daniel Hayes, invitation to consult. But she didn't send it. Not yet. Something in her told her this man didn't respond well to authority. He'd show up for people, not policies. She'd need to meet him where he was. That night, Daniel tucked Lily into bed, brushing a stray lock of hair from her face. "Did you save someone today?" she asked sleepily. He paused. "No," he said softly, "but I think I helped someone understand what was happening." Lily smiled. "That's like saving someone. Just quieter." He turned off the light and sat on the edge of her bed, staring out the window. In another life, he used words as armor, as power, as distance. Now, for the first time in years, he wondered if his words could become bridges again. Saturday mornings in Willow Creek had their own rhythm, slow, sun-warmed, and coated in the scent of backyard barbecues and morning coffee. Daniel had the front door open to let in the breeze, a box fan humming gently in the living room, as Lily sat cross-legged on the floor, surrounded by construction paper and uncapped markers. She was trying to make a birthday card for a classmate whose name she kept forgetting. Daniel was halfway under the kitchen sink, fixing a slow leak that had finally turned into a steady drip. "Is it done yet?" Lily called. "Define done," Daniel replied, wiping his hands on an old towel. "It's not leaking, which is a personal victory. That means pizza for lunch." He glanced at her over his shoulder. "Is that how plumbing works now?" "Always has," she grinned. He laughed just as a soft knock landed on the screen door. He wasn't expecting anyone. Only 3 people ever visited unannounced, his elderly neighbor, Mr. Torres, usually needing help with his TV, the mailman usually dropping the wrong mail, or not her. Not the woman standing in tailored slacks and a pale blouse holding a folder and a smile so composed it could pass as impersonal, if not for the slight breathlessness in her eyes. "Mr. Hayes." He stood straighter. "Yes, I'm Olivia Morgan," she said, "CEO of St. Mary's Hospital." Daniel's brows lifted in surprise. "I hope I'm not intruding. I wanted to thank you in person for what you did the other day at the hospital, for helping those tourists." He stepped outside, gently closing the screen behind him. "I wasn't aware CEOs made house calls." "Neither was I," she admitted, then gestured to the park. "But I couldn't shake what I saw. You handled that situation better than any trained staff we had." He said nothing at first, just studied her. Most people tried to win trust with warmth or flattery. Olivia used precision. There was something guarded behind her courtesy. Not dishonest, just careful. "I didn't do it for credit," Daniel said. "I know. That's why I'm here." There was a pause. Then the door creaked open again. Dad Lily peeked out. "Oh," Olivia said softly. "Hi there." Lily blinked. "Are you a social worker?" Daniel chuckled. "No, sweetheart. This is Ms. Morgan. She works at the hospital." "I'm not in trouble, right?" Lily asked, narrowing her eyes. Only with me if you use permanent marker on the walls again, Daniel warned. Olivia smiled, and for the first time it wasn't the kind of smile she wore in meetings or press interviews. It was warmer, almost. Curious. You have a beautiful daughter, she said. Thank you, Daniel replied, his tone proud and subtly protective. I wanted to ask, Olivia continued, if you'd consider consulting with the hospital just part-time. We're starting a multilingual outreach program, and we could use someone with your experience. My experience, Daniel echoed, as if trying the phrase on. You know, I'm not licensed. Or trained in medicine. But you're trained in something, she said. You don't speak 4 languages fluently because you fixed a few hotel air conditioners overseas. That made him go still. I don't mean to pry, Olivia added gently. But if you have a gift, and you clearly do, it would mean a lot to share it where it's most needed. Daniel glanced past her toward Lily, who had now returned to her markers, humming softly. I've spent the last 7 years trying to build something quiet, he said. No exposure, no titles, just stability for her. And for me. I understand, Olivia said, and something in her voice sounded painfully sincere. Sometimes quiet is the only thing we can afford, but I think you've got more left to give than you think. He didn't answer, not immediately. Instead, he turned open the screen door and paused. I'm not saying yes, he told her, but I'm not saying no either. She nodded. Fair enough. Then, almost on impulse, she added, There's a community dinner we're hosting Tuesday night. Patients, families, staff, nothing formal, just stories and people. You're welcome to join us. Daniel raised an eyebrow. As a guest, or as a curiosity? She smiled again, this time with the faintest hint of self-deprecation. As someone we'd like to hear from. Then she left. That evening, Daniel sat in the backyard, an old blanket draped over the grass, while Lily laid beside him, pointing out stars. Did you like the hospital lady? She asked. I don't know her. She seemed nice. She seemed interested. You, Daniel, didn't respond. But his mind drifted to the way Olivia looked at him, not with pity or condescension, but as if she saw past the toolbox, the calloused hands, the modest life he'd chosen. As if she knew he used to be something else. Someone else. He exhaled. Do you think it's bad to do something big again? He asked, mostly to himself. Lily shrugged. I think it's good if it helps people. And if it helps you too. From the mouths of children. Meanwhile, across town, Olivia sat at her desk long after sunset. The lights of the city blinked outside her office window. On her tablet screen was the folder she hadn't closed since yesterday. Daniel Hayes. Quiet Cases. She clicked open a new page and began typing strengths fluent in 4 languages. Crisis de-escalation. Deep empathy. Risks avoids attention. Possible trauma history. Unknowns. Prior occupation. Motivation for staying hidden. Gut instinct. He's the kind of man who left something behind. Question: is he willing to go back for the right reason? She stared at that last line for a long moment, then deleted it. Instead, she typed, sometimes the best voices are the ones we almost didn't hear. The community room at St. Mary's Hospital didn't look like much white walls, scuffed linoleum floor-folding chairs arranged in a loose semicircle, but Olivia Morgan had spent hours ensuring that everything felt less clinical and more human. String lights hung overhead, borrowed from the pediatric ward's supply closet. Each table had a modest arrangement of sunflowers in mason jars. The food, simple homemade dishes, lined a buffet table in the corner. This was her first initiative without a press release, without board oversight, and without her father's approval. It was purely hers, and she couldn't stop watching the front entrance. He's not coming, she whispered to herself, adjusting the hem of her blazer. Who asked Claire, the hospital's community director, handing Olivia a cup of coffee? No one. Just someone I invited. Claire smiled knowingly. It's the quiet ones. They always show up late and change the night. Daniel stood outside for a full 2 minutes before walking in. He had dressed carefully. Not formally, but respectfully pressed shirt, clean jeans boots, polished as best he could. He still felt like an imposter stepping into a world he used to belong to, but no longer trusted. Inside, he was immediately greeted by a warm din of conversation patients in wheelchairs, elderly visitors, nurses out of uniform. There was no agenda, just people. He stood near the doorway, uncertain. And then he saw her. Olivia was laughing softly with a retired doctor who was sharing stories from his days in Doctors Without Borders. Her expression was different tonight, lighter, like she wasn't carrying the hospital on her back for once. She turned, felt his presence before she saw him, and smiled. "You came." "I brought a peace offering," Daniel said, holding up a small tin. "Lily and I made cookies." "Well, she made a mess. I just supervised." Olivia laughed. "That counts." He followed her into the room, and soon enough the cookies found their way to the dessert table, while Daniel found himself seated next to an elderly man named Mr. Braddock, who was missing part of his hearing, but none of his stories. As conversations floated around the room, Daniel remained mostly quiet, listening, observing. But then a woman in a wheelchair, a woman he faintly recognized from the tourist incident, called out to him, You're the man from the hallway, with the languages." He offered a small nod. "Yes, ma'am. That was me." "You saved my sister's life." "I didn't save her. I just made it easier for help to reach her." "Same thing, sweetheart," she said, raising a cup and toast. The room quieted slightly as heads turned toward him. Someone asked, "What made you learn all those languages?" Daniel hesitated. The air shifted expectant. "Truth is," he said slowly, "I used to work in government service. International relations. I spent years learning how to speak other people's languages, how to translate pain, anger, misunderstanding into something human." He paused. His eyes found Olivia, and she gave him the smallest, most encouraging nod. "But somewhere along the line, I stopped using those words for people. I started using them for systems, for policies. Until one day, I didn't recognize who I was anymore." The room held its breath. "So I left," he finished, "started fixing air conditioners and water heaters. Because sometimes when the world feels too big, you find comfort in things that break in ways you understand." Someone murmured, "Amen" to that. Laughter bubbled up gently like an exhale the room had been holding in. Later that evening, Daniel wandered out of the room and into the quiet hallway. That's when he heard a soft sob muffled behind the slightly ajar door of room 2B. He knocked lightly, then stepped in. Inside was a young woman, no older than 20, sitting beside a hospital bed. Her mother lay sleeping, her breathing shallow. The daughter's shoulders shook. Daniel didn't say anything at first. He just stood there, then pulled a chair beside her. She looked up, startled, but something in his presence made her pause. "I don't know what to say to her," the girl whispered. "She doesn't speak English, only Russian. And I never learned it well enough. I was born here. She raised me alone." Daniel's voice was gentle. "May I?" He stepped forward and spoke quietly in Russian, introducing himself, explaining that he was here to help. The mother stirred slightly, eyes fluttering open. He leaned in closer, whispering her daughter's words. Words of love, gratitude, apology for the times she'd been too busy, too American, too far. Words the mother heard and understood, tears slipping silently down her cheeks. The daughter cried too, but this time with relief. When Daniel stepped out of the room 20 minutes later, Olivia was waiting. "I saw you go in," she said. "I didn't follow. I waited." Daniel nodded. Her daughter didn't have the words, but she had the heart. Sometimes that's enough. They stood in silence for a moment. Then Olivia said softly, "You ever think maybe you were never meant to leave that world behind, that maybe the person you used to be was just waiting for the right time to come back?" Daniel looked at her eyes, tired but clear. I think he said that part of me never left. I just needed someone to remember I was still worth listening to. She looked at him then, not as a guest or a consultant or a mystery to be solved, but as a man who still had something rare to give. "Thank you for coming tonight," she said. "You didn't just speak their language. You reminded them they still mattered." Daniel nodded. "That's all any of us really want, isn't it?" "To matter," she echoed. They stood side by side in the hallway outside room 2B as the hospital quieted for the night, two people who had spent years learning how to speak for others now, slowly learning how to be heard themselves. The next morning, sunlight filtered through the kitchen window of Unit 14, casting soft gold across the worn counter where Daniel stood whisking eggs. The skillet hissed gently beside him, scent of butter and pepper filling the small space. Lily sat at the table, absently coloring a page from her astronomy workbook. "Did you like the dinner?" she asked, not looking up. Daniel turned the heat down. "I did." "Did she like you?" Lily glanced up, now eyes sharp and curious. He gave her a look. "What makes you think that—" "You came home humming," she said, matter-of-factly. "You only do that when you feel seen." Daniel paused. That wasn't something a 10-year-old should notice. And yet she had. He sighed softly and placed 2 plates on the table. Olivia's. He hesitated. "She's different. Different how she listens without interrupting. But not because she's polite, because she's actually listening." Lily nodded, biting into her toast. "That's rare. You should keep her." Daniel chuckled. "It's not that simple." "Why not?" He didn't answer. Not because he couldn't, but because part of him wasn't ready to say it out loud. That sometimes people who saw the best in you also had the power to see the worst and stay anyway. And he wasn't sure if he was ready to risk that again. Later that day, Daniel stepped into his workshop behind the trailer, a small converted shed lined with tool racks and dusty storage boxes. He hadn't opened one of them in years, but today something pulled him toward it. The box was labeled simply DH, State Archives. He opened it slowly. Inside, folders worn with time, notebooks filled with annotations, a State Department badge, a photo of him years younger standing between delegates from 3 countries during a negotiation that never made the news but changed 6 lives. He ran a finger over the photograph's edge, remembering not the conference room, but the pressure, the impossible expectations, the silence he was expected to keep. One folder sat alone at the bottom, unmarked. He hesitated, then opened it. Inside was the letter, the one he never mailed, addressed to the Office of Internal Ethics, a whistleblower complaint. It outlined his objections to a redacted diplomatic briefing that was falsified before being delivered to Congress. He had refused to sign. And everything afterward, his resignation, the quiet pressure to disappear the jobs that stopped calling back, had stemmed from that refusal. His hands trembled just slightly. That part of his life wasn't behind him. It had merely gone quiet, like a language he no longer spoke. Across town, Olivia sat in the hospital's boardroom, a manila folder open before her. It was Daniel's full background check, or at least what had been publicly available. Most of it matched the hospital file freelancer, no criminal record single parent. But one thing stuck out, a gap of nearly 4 years after his resignation from federal service. No listed employment. No records at all. She tapped the table softly. Claire sat beside her sorting files for a separate community initiative. "You look like someone who just found a ghost." "Maybe I did," Olivia murmured. Claire looked over. "You worried?" "No, just wondering why a man who can translate 4 languages and calm a room like he was born to do it would choose to be invisible." Claire smiled faintly. "Sometimes people don't choose silence. Sometimes silence chooses them. And survival means learning how to live inside it." Olivia closed the file. "I think it's time we give him a reason to speak again." That evening, Daniel received an envelope. It wasn't official, no hospital letterhead, no return address. Inside was a handwritten note. Room 4C, Tuesday at 9 a.m. We have a patient who only speaks Arabic and won't let anyone near her child. No obligations. But we thought of you. Oh. He stared at it for a long while, the weight of the invitation heavier than its few words. He had learned Arabic during a 2-year rotation in Jordan back when he believed language was enough to build bridges across pain. He hadn't used it in over a decade. Tuesday morning came fast. Daniel stood outside room 4C, dressed simply but neatly the same way he might have for a briefing minus the suit, plus 7 years of living between silence and socket wrenches. A nurse glanced up as he knocked lightly and pushed the door open. Inside, a woman in her early 30s sat curled protectively around a small child on the hospital bed. Her eyes were wide, frightened. Her hands clutched the child's shoulders tightly every time anyone in scrubs passed by the door. Daniel stepped inside, slowly, palms visible, voice low. He greeted her in Arabic. She froze, then answered cautiously, her words uncertain. He responded gently, explaining who he was, not a doctor, not here to hurt, just someone who understood. He sat a few feet away, not approaching the bed. He let her speak. Her accent was Syrian. Her husband had died crossing the border. The child had a fever for 3 days before she gathered the courage to come here, but when no one understood, her fear returned. Daniel asked if he could translate her story to the nurse. She nodded. 15 minutes later, she smiled for the first time. The nurse entered the room without tension. The child, still flushed, clutched a toy Daniel had retrieved from the hallway, a small giraffe someone left behind. Olivia watched from outside. She didn't enter. She didn't need to. She already knew what she'd see, a man who thought he had walked away from his calling now returning to it, not through obligation, but through compassion. When Daniel stepped out of the room, Olivia was still there. He said nothing. Neither did she. But for the first time there was no distance between them, only understanding. And the start of something neither one dared to name yet. The news broke just after dawn. A child admitted with a high fever, missed intake paperwork, a language barrier, a delayed treatment order. By the time the hospital realized the child was in septic shock, it was too late. The boy passed at 4:07 a.m. Olivia stared at the report on her desk, her hands trembling just enough for the coffee in her mug to ripple. The intake nurse had panicked and checked the wrong box. The child's mother didn't speak English. The interpreter on call never showed. It was everything Olivia had feared and everything the board had warned her about. Her phone rang. It was David Lang, the chair of the hospital's board. Olivia, his voice was clipped, rehearsed. You need to prepare a statement. This will go public by noon, and the board has decided it's time we bring in external leadership. I've scheduled a vote for next Friday. You'll want to be ready. She gripped the edge of her desk. This wasn't neglect. It was communication failure. This is exactly why we started the outreach. The outreach hasn't scaled, he interrupted. You've implemented pilot programs, yes, but we need infrastructure, Olivia. Liability protection. Shareholder trust. You're not here to be the heart. You're here to be the spine. The call ended before she could speak again. Olivia leaned forward, forehead resting in her hands, the weight of an entire institution pressing against her chest. Across town, Daniel was installing a new unit at a rundown laundromat when his phone buzzed. A news alert. Language barrier leads to child's death at St. Mary's Hospital. CEO faces scrutiny. He stared at the headline. The image accompanying the article showed a grainy, zoomed-in photo of Olivia entering the hospital, shoulders, squared eyes, unreadable. He knew that look. He'd worn it once. The mask of someone about to be blamed for a system's failure. A familiar nausea settled in his stomach. He turned off the drill, packed up his tools, and drove straight to the hospital. Olivia didn't look up when the knock came. "Come in," she said, already bracing for another reporter, another board member, another crisis. But it was Daniel. His presence filled the room not with answers, but with presence, a rare kind of calm, forged not in indifference, but in experience. "You saw," she said quietly. He nodded. "I tried Daniel. I really did. I pushed for training for hiring a multilingual staff. But they care more about optics than access, about speed than safety. And now, a child is gone." She didn't cry. That was what hurt him most. She looked like someone who wanted to cry but had been told too many times not to. Daniel sat across from her. "This isn't your fault," she scoffed. "Isn't it you don't control every intake, every form, every delay?" "But I said we could handle it," she whispered. "I told them we were building the system to prevent this." "You were," he said. "But a system built right takes time, and they're using tragedy as an excuse to strip you of authority." She looked up at him now, eyes sharper wounded. "You sound like you've seen this before." "I have," he said, "and I lost everything because I stayed silent." The silence in the room thickened. Olivia leaned forward. "What happened, Daniel? What did you walk away from?" He took a breath. "I was assigned to an international committee," he began. "We were supposed to review intel for a pending trade agreement, but one report, just one, had language that didn't match the original source. I flagged it. They asked me to let it go. It won't affect anything, they said, but it would have. It would have misrepresented an entire ethnic group, justified a policy that would hurt families. I refused to sign." "And they buried it?" Olivia asked. "They buried me," Daniel said, voice low. "Overnight, my clearance was suspended. Job offers vanished. Even people I mentored stopped calling back. The message was clear: speak up, disappear." He looked at her then, not just as an ally, but as someone who could soon face the same fate. "They're going to use this," he said. "Not to fix the system, but to replace you with someone easier to control." "I know," she said. "But you still have time." She looked at him unsure. Time to do what? To fight it, not with politics or statements, with truth, with people who'll stand beside you, not behind closed doors, but in front of them. Daniel reached into his pocket and slid a folded sheet of paper across her desk. It was a list, names of patients, nurses, volunteers, people from the multilingual outreach events who wanted to testify to speak about the program's impact, in different languages. On the record. Olivia unfolded it slowly. "How did you get these?" He gave a half smile. "I asked. Turns out kindness has a longer memory than scandal." She exhaled, then looked him dead in the eye. "Would you speak at the hearing?" "Yes. On record." "Yes, even if it brings your past back into the spotlight." Daniel nodded once. "It's already back. I'd rather be the one holding the light than hiding from it." For the first time since the crisis broke, Olivia's shoulders relaxed. Not because the storm had passed, but because she wasn't alone in it. That evening, as twilight turned the sky gold, Olivia walked into the pediatric wing and sat beside the empty bed in room 219, the boy who didn't survive. She placed a small origami crane on the pillow folded from the hospital's intake form. No press, no audience, just silence. Then she stood and began preparing for war, not with anger, but with truth, and the quiet army that had begun to rise around her. The hearing room on the 5th floor of City Hall was sterile and cold, a place where words were dissected rather than understood. Long mahogany tables divided the space between those who spoke and those who judged. Reporters lined the back wall, their camera lenses watching like predators in tall grass. Olivia stood in front of the microphone, her hands folded calmly, though every fiber of her body vibrated with the weight of what was at stake. Behind her sat the hospital board members, men in navy suits who once welcomed her as a legacy leader, and now, after one tragedy, had turned stone-faced. Across the aisle sat families, community volunteers, and patients. The room was fuller than she expected. Too full for her to believe this was just another review meeting. This was war. The chair of the review committee cleared his throat. Ms. Morgan, as CEO of St. Mary's, do you accept full responsibility for the recent death due to a language barrier under your leadership at TRAP? I accept responsibility for the system I inherited, the one I've been working tirelessly to change, she said evenly. But I will not accept the notion that meaningful reform can be demanded overnight without proper investment or support. The room murmured. Cameras clicked. The chair raised an eyebrow. Are you suggesting the board failed to support your reforms? I'm stating that silence isn't just a lack of language, Olivia replied. It's also a lack of commitment. The patient who died deserved better. But so do the multilingual families we've served over the past 6 months who did receive care because of the very outreach programs now at risk. She turned toward the audience. Some of them are here today. I ask the committee's permission to let them speak. A pause. The chair nodded reluctantly. They have 5 minutes. The first woman rose, elderly Spanish-speaking, with a nurse translating beside her. She spoke of the night her husband collapsed in their kitchen and how Daniel's presence in the ER made her feel safe in a place where she once felt invisible. Another voice followed a Congolese father whose son had undergone surgery, a Japanese grandmother, a Haitian teen. Each told a different story with the same ending they were heard. Then Daniel stood. He didn't take the microphone. He stood beside Olivia instead. My name is Daniel Hayes, he began, voice firm. I've served this hospital informally for months. I've translated for patients in French, Japanese, Russian, Arabic, and Spanish. Not for pay, not for recognition. But because when someone is in pain and no one speaks their language, that pain deepens. A reporter's camera flashed. But I also come from another world, Daniel continued. I once worked as a diplomatic interpreter. I know what happens when information is distorted, when people pretend understanding isn't necessary. It cost me my career. He pulled a folded sheet from his pocket. This is a copy of a letter I wrote over a decade ago. I never mailed it. It documented falsified reports that could have endangered a minority population during a negotiation. I refused to lie. I refused to sign, and I was erased for it. A ripple of silence swept the room. I've lived quietly since then, raising my daughter, fixing air conditioners, and watching a world that sometimes moves too fast to care. But I came back to this hospital not for redemption, but because I saw a woman fighting to change a broken system from the inside out. He looked at Olivia. She didn't ask me to speak, but I won't let another good person be silenced while the powerful wait for the dust to settle. He stepped back. The room didn't erupt in applause. It went still. A kind of reverence filled the air, not for Daniel, not even for Olivia, but for the truth itself. Raw, undeniable. That evening, Olivia stood in the hospital garden watching dusk settle over the city. Wind moved gently through the lavender bushes planted by the nurses on Mother's Day. Her blazer hung over one arm. Her shoes were off. Daniel approached quietly, holding 2 coffees. You were extraordinary today, he said. She turned to him. You were the earthquake. I didn't mean to be. Yes, you did, she said, and I'm glad you were. They sat on a low stone bench beneath a flowering tree. A hummingbird darted between the branches, completely unaware that 2 people below had just changed the course of something much larger than themselves. Do you regret it? She asked. Speaking the truth, no. Letting them see you again. Daniel looked up at the sky, the color of steel and fading gold. I think I've hidden for so long I forgot what it felt like to be seen and not be in danger. She didn't reply. She just leaned her shoulder slightly into his. He didn't move away. I'll still probably lose the vote, she murmured after a while. Maybe he said. But now they'll know it wasn't because you failed. It was because you refused to become what they expected. She smiled faintly. You always speak like you're translating something deeper. Maybe I am. Their eyes met something quiet and unresolved passing between them. Not a confession, not yet, but a promise that something had begun. Not in a boardroom, not in a language, but in understanding. It rained the morning of the vote. Not the kind of dramatic storm that made headlines or flooded sidewalks, but a soft, persistent drizzle, the kind that seeps into your bones and makes everything feel heavier than it is. Olivia stood in the staff parking lot staring up at the gray sky, her blazer draped over one-arm hair pulled into a practical twist. Inside, the board was preparing. She knew their rhythm by now, the private discussions, the casual but loaded glances, the veiled language of liability and reputation. What they didn't say was louder than what they did. She pulled her phone from her pocket thumb, hovering over Daniel's number. She hadn't seen him since the hearing 2 days ago. Not because she didn't want to, but because something in her had changed. She wasn't standing alone anymore, but that also meant she couldn't run from herself. She didn't call. Instead, she turned and walked toward the entrance. Daniel was already there. He stood just outside the auditorium, dressed in a charcoal button-down and jeans hands folded behind his back. He hadn't been asked to attend. He had chosen to. He watched as hospital staff filed in, some hopeful, some resigned. Claire approached him with a warm smile and a nod. "She's going to be fine," she said. Daniel nodded, though something in his chest pulled tight. "She's brave. She's not the only one." He gave a quiet smile, then stepped aside, watching the glass doors swing closed behind the last board member. The vote was in motion, and the outcome was out of their hands. Inside the auditorium, Olivia stood tall as the chair of the board announced the motion: to instate external leadership over St. Mary's Community Hospital and transition CEO responsibilities, effective immediately. The vote was called. One by one, hands raised. 7 members, 4 in favor, 2 against. Then came David Lang, the chair. His vote would break the tie. He looked at Olivia for a long time, then his hand rose against. A collective exhale rippled across the room. Lang cleared his throat. "The motion fails. Ms. Morgan will retain her position as CEO." Olivia didn't move. Not immediately. Then she turned, nodded to the room, and walked out. Not in triumph, but with a kind of grace that belongs only to those who have fought hard enough to earn it. Outside, Daniel stood beneath the awning, watching the last of the rain taper off. When he saw her approach, he stepped forward. "They kept you." She smiled. "No, I stayed." He nodded. "I'm glad." She studied him for a moment, her eyes quieter than her voice. "There's something I want to show you," she said. They walked in silence through the east wing of the hospital, down a hallway recently painted and lined with framed photos, patients, nurses, community members, volunteers. At the end of the corridor was a door marked Outreach Room A. Inside, a small group of patients and translators were gathered in a circle. A young nurse handed out laminated cards, each with a phrase written in English, Spanish, and Vietnamese. Daniel watched as a child read aloud, "My pain is sharp." Then her mother repeated the phrase in Spanish. The translator guided her through pronunciation. It was a small thing, but enormous. Olivia turned to him. "This is just the beginning. We'll train more, fund more, bring in community leaders from every language group we serve." Daniel's eyes flicked to the banner above the doorway. "Language is care." He smiled. "You're changing the system from within." "You helped me remember why it matters," she said, "and why it's not about speaking perfectly, but listening fully." They stepped outside the room. For a long beat, neither said anything. Then Olivia reached into her pocket and handed him a folded piece of paper. It was a hand-drawn flyer. A list of upcoming community nights translated into 5 languages. In the corner beneath the contact name was his Daniel Hayes, lead cultural consultant. He blinked. "I didn't apply. You didn't have to." He opened his mouth to protest, then stopped. "I'd have to say no to a few repair jobs," he said with a smirk, "and say yes to something bigger." He looked at her. Not the CEO, not the woman in the blazer and the title, but the woman who had chosen not to fold when it would have been easier. "I don't have a title for what this is between us," he said. "You don't need one," she replied, and then she did something neither of them expected. She reached out and took his hand. Not bold, not desperate, just steady. "Language is care," she said softly, "but sometimes silence says the most." Daniel didn't speak. He didn't need to. Instead, he tightened his fingers around hers and stood beside her. Because for the first time in a very long time, he wasn't translating someone else's truth. He was living his own. It was Sunday morning, the kind that unfolded gently quiet wind brushing against the window panes, the scent of cinnamon, and brewed coffee floating through Daniel's small kitchen. Lily sat at the table in her favorite hoodie sleeves, too long for her arms, hunched over a crossword puzzle with her tongue peeking out in concentration. Daniel across the table was holding a pen he hadn't used in years. A real one. Not for invoices or repair notes or hospital forms, but for words that mattered. He glanced at his daughter, then looked down again at the blank sheet of paper in front of him, the kind that felt heavier than its weight. He began writing. "Dear Lily, if you're reading this someday, it means I've finally found the courage to put down the things I've been carrying, the things I never meant for you to hold. You once asked me why I knew so many languages. I told you stories about traveling, about school, about fixing things for people who couldn't explain what was broken. That was only part of the truth. Years ago, before you were born, I worked with people who made decisions that shaped countries. My job was to make sure everyone understood each other word for word. I thought that if I translated well enough, no one would feel unseen. But one day, I saw something I couldn't translate into anything good. A document rewritten to hide pain. A truth bent to justify harm. I was asked to sign it. I said no. That no changed everything. The phone stopped ringing. Doors closed without being slammed. I became invisible. And maybe that was fair because I had been part of something that left people voiceless even if I didn't mean to be. When your mom passed, I didn't know how to be a father and a man without a title at the same time. I didn't know how to build a life out of silence. But then you arrived with your laughter and your stubbornness and your fire. You asked questions I didn't want to answer. And then, one day, you stopped asking and just trusted me anyway. You gave me back my voice without even knowing it. Last week I saw a little girl at the hospital. She was crying, and her mother didn't speak English. No one understood what she needed. I translated the girl's fear into words the nurses could use to save her. And for the first time in years, I felt like I belonged somewhere again. Because of you, Lily. You made me brave enough to speak again. So, wherever you go in this world, however many languages you learn, however many things you decide to build or heal, remember this. Words can tear things down, but the right ones spoken at the right time can bring people back to life. Just like you did for me. Love, Dad. Daniel folded the letter slowly, hands trembling not from fear, but from relief. He didn't know when he'd give it to her. Maybe not today. Maybe not until she needed it. But the words were real now. They existed. Later that afternoon, Daniel and Lily walked down the sidewalk toward the hospital's community garden. She skipped ahead, twirling in the last golden light of fall, her braid bouncing as she laughed. Daniel watched her like he always did, half in awe, half in disbelief that someone so small could hold so much of his heart. At the hospital gate, Olivia was waiting. She wore a loose denim jacket over a turtleneck and jeans, her hair down for once, waving in the wind like something alive. In her hands was a steaming thermos and a bag of Lily's favorite lemon cookies. "You're here," she said, smiling. Lily ran ahead to greet her, accepting the cookies with the seriousness of a business deal. Daniel approached slower, but the smile that pulled at the corner of his mouth was easier now, less like a reflex, more like a choice. "We were overdue for sunshine," he said. Olivia gestured toward a bench in the middle of the garden beneath the old oak tree where volunteers had tied ribbons with names and prayers. They sat in companionable quiet while Lily explored the rows of herbs and sunflowers. "I heard about the hearing follow-up," Daniel said eventually. "You got funding approved for the expanded outreach." Olivia nodded. 25 new interpreters, plus cultural training for all staff, full-time roles with benefits. He raised an eyebrow. That's big. It's necessary. She turned to him, her expression softer. And I couldn't have done it without you. Daniel looked away, not out of modesty, but because something inside him still struggled to accept being seen as part of something good again. You did it because it was right, he said. So did you, she replied. You didn't just speak up. You stayed. You stood next to me. He gave a slow nod. Then she added more quietly, You don't know what that meant to me. He did, because in her eyes he saw the same thing he'd seen in his own reflection the day he started writing to Lily, a person no longer hiding, a person building again. She reached out her hand, brushing his on the bench, and this time he took it without hesitation, not because he needed her to fix him, but because she never asked him to. They watched Lily chase a butterfly between the flower beds, giggling as she nearly tripped over her own shoelace. I think she's going to change the world, Olivia said. Daniel smiled. She already changed mine. The hospital auditorium looked nothing like it had 6 weeks ago. The harsh overhead lights had been dimmed to a gentle amber glow. Rows of chairs had been rearranged into circles, inviting conversation rather than division. The podium was replaced by a simple microphone stand in the center of the room. Around the perimeter, small placards in multiple languages read, Tonight we listen in every language. The event was called the Night of Quiet Voices, an idea Olivia and Daniel had co-created after the board vote. No speeches, no donors, just stories, real ones told by the people whose lives had been changed by the act of being understood. Daniel arrived early. He wore a soft, black sweater sleeves pushed up and jeans that still had traces of caulk along the seams from a morning repair job. He didn't dress for attention. He never had. But Olivia noticed anyway. You came, she said as he joined her near the stage. I promised I would. She looked at him for a beat, then reached into her coat pocket and handed him a small folded piece of paper. His name was written on the front. He opened it. Inside was a printed copy of the hospital's newly ratified charter, highlighted in yellow the line, Cultural Consultant. Daniel Hayes, Founding Contributor. He blinked. I didn't know you were submitting this to the board. I didn't ask for permission, she said. I just gave them the truth. Daniel folded the paper carefully this time and placed it in the inside pocket of his coat like it was something sacred. Olivia continued, I'm introducing you tonight, but the mic is yours. Say whatever you want. Daniel smiled faintly. I'm better when I don't prepare. I know, she replied, and the ease between them said more than any script could. By 7 o'clock the room was full. Nurses still in scrubs. Elderly couples bundled in scarves, high school students with clipboards, refugees with weathered hands, people who had once walked into St. Mary's afraid unheard, unseen, and had found someone who spoke their language literally or figuratively. Olivia stepped up first, offering only a short welcome. No introductions tonight, she said. No credentials, just voices. She stepped aside and Daniel walked into the center. There was no podium to stand behind. Just him, the mic, and a room full of eyes that were tired of being looked through. He cleared his throat. I never thought I'd speak in a place like this again. A pause. I used to think language was about power. If you knew the right words, you could change the outcome of a meeting, negotiate peace, avoid disaster. He looked around the room. But that's not true. Language isn't power. Kindness is. And kindness doesn't always come in full sentences. He took a breath. 7 years ago, I lost my voice not because I forgot how to speak, but because I stopped believing anyone wanted to listen. I fixed machines. I disappeared from the rooms I once walked into with a badge. He turned slightly, his gaze resting on Olivia in the crowd. But then, one day someone believed I still had something to say, and she didn't try to translate me. She just let me speak. The room was silent. I'm not here tonight to talk about policy. I'm not here to defend a program or a protocol. I'm here because once a woman who didn't speak English trusted me to tell her story to a nurse. And her son lived. He stepped back. And that's what language really is when one human being says, "I see you," and the other finally believes it. A quiet ripple moved through the crowd. Then, one by one, others stood. A teenage girl who had once arrived at the ER terrified her undocumented parents would be turned away. A nurse who learned Tagalog to comfort a dying woman. A janitor who knew sign language and used it to explain test results when no one else could. No applause, no clapping, just listening. And in that listening, healing. Afterward, the auditorium slowly emptied, but Daniel remained in the center, folding up chairs with Lily, who had appointed herself hospital event manager for the night. Olivia stayed nearby, sipping lukewarm cider from a paper cup. Claire approached her. It worked. Olivia nodded. It did more than work. It reminded people who we are. She glanced at Daniel, crouched beside his daughter, laughing as she dramatically ordered him around. "You know," Claire said gently, "I think the man you were afraid to believe in again. He's standing right there." Olivia smiled, but it held a weight. "I think I believed in him from the first moment. I just didn't know how to tell him." Claire tilted her head. "Then maybe it's time you stopped translating your heart and just say it." When the last chair was stacked and the room was nearly dark, Olivia approached Daniel. He looked up, wiping his hands on a towel. "Did we pass?" "With colors flying," she said, "and no one fainted. Minor miracle." She hesitated, then offered him her hand, not as a colleague, not as a symbol. Just as a woman reaching for a man who had shown her that silence can be sacred, but words, when chosen with care, can change everything. He took it, and in that touch, something closed. Not a chapter, but a wound. She stepped closer. "You once said words can bring people back to life." "I remember." She searched his eyes. "Then say something real." Daniel leaned in, forehead resting gently against hers. He whispered, "Stay." And she did. Spring arrived in Willow Creek with a kind of quiet insistence. Daffodils pushing up through the hard soil trees, lining the streets in fresh green whispers, and the air full of the scent of something starting over. Daniel stood in front of Unit 14, keys in hand, a worn cardboard box tucked under one arm. The door had just been painted a soft, welcoming blue, and the rusted porch rail had finally been replaced. It wasn't fancy, but it was home. Inside, Lily sat cross-legged in the center of the living room, taping a hand-lettered sign above the doorway that read, "Room 14, where words begin again." She grinned when she saw her dad walk in. Too cheesy, Daniel chuckled. Cheesy in the best way. He set the box down and looked around. The shelves were lined with more books now, language dictionaries, yes, but also storybooks in Spanish, Arabic, and Japanese. A small corner desk held Lily's drawings and a printout of her latest school essay, "Why My Dad is My Hero." There was a second toothbrush in the bathroom, and a denim jacket hanging behind the door. 2 weeks earlier, Olivia had surprised them both. It was supposed to be a short visit, just a walk through the community center's new translation booth, then coffee in the courtyard. But Lily had tugged her hand and said, "You should see room 14. Dad says it's magic." And Olivia had gone, not out of obligation, but out of something deeper, curiosity, care, and maybe the hope that she could belong somewhere that had nothing to do with boardrooms or title plaques. That night, she'd stood in Daniel's kitchen with the porch light casting gold against her shoulders and said, "This feels like breathing." He'd nodded, then quietly replied, "You don't have to leave when the air changes." She hadn't. Now the days had settled into a rhythm that didn't feel rushed. Daniel continued consulting at the hospital, now mentoring a team of interpreters. Every Thursday, he hosted language and listening circles in the community garden, where people came not to speak perfectly, but to speak honestly. Olivia continued her work as CEO, though the title mattered less than it once had. What mattered now were the quiet changes she'd championed. The kind that didn't make headlines but made people feel safe. They didn't rush love. They lived it slowly, like conversation in a language neither of them had learned from books but from pain trust and beginning again. One Saturday morning, Daniel took Lily to the park while Olivia stayed back to make lunch. She moved through the kitchen like she'd always belonged there, hair pinned up sleeves rolled, humming a tune she couldn't name but somehow knew by heart. On the kitchen counter sat a small envelope addressed in Daniel's handwriting. She opened it. It wasn't a love letter in the usual sense. No declarations, no grand metaphors, just 3 simple lines. You never tried to fix me. You just gave me space to return to myself. And I'm better because you did. She read it twice, then placed it beside the sunflowers in the mason jar on the table and stood by the window watching the 2 people she loved most chasing each other beneath the new leaves. She didn't wave, she didn't call out, she just watched, and felt full in a way she hadn't in years. That evening, the 3 of them sat on the front steps of room 14, sharing ice cream straight from the tub. The sun dipped low, bathing the street in honey-colored light. Children's laughter echoed from down the block. Somewhere, a wind chime clinked softly like a bell remembering a melody. Dad, Lily said, licking her spoon, "Do you think people can really start over? Like, completely?" Daniel glanced at Olivia, then looked down at his daughter. "I don't think we ever start over," he said. "I think we just start truer." Olivia leaned her head against his shoulder. "That sounds like something someone fluent in 5 languages would say." He smiled. "Technically 6. I've been learning Korean with Lily." Lily grinned. "I'm a tough teacher." "Tell me about it," Olivia said. And they laughed, not loudly but deeply. The kind of laughter that came from healing places, from old scars finally given new names, survival strength love. As the sky darkened, Daniel reached into his pocket and pulled out a small stone. He handed it to Lily. "What's this for?" she asked. "It's for the jar," he said. In their hallway sat a glass jar labeled Kindness Kept. Every time someone did something kind without expecting anything in return, they placed a stone in the jar. Lily turned the stone in her hand, then dropped it in. A soft clink. One more kindness. One more language of love spoken without a word. And so, in a small house with a blue door beneath a sky that promised new days, 3 people who had once lived between silences built a life full of listening, full of understanding, and above all, full of the kind of love that didn't need to be translated, because it was already understood. Where are you watching from? We'd love to know where in the world our listeners are tuning in. Share your location in the comments below. If this story touched you, don't forget to subscribe to the channel for more heartwarming tales of resilience, kindness, and quiet love. Thank you so much for spending your time with us. We're truly grateful you're here.